June 6, 1944. Dawn is breaking over the English Channel. The sea is rough, churning violently as smoke from naval bombardments drifts low across the water. Landing craft rise and fall in the heavy surf, each one carrying men towards the coast of France. Naval guns fire thunderously, their shells screaming inland. This is Normandy. This is D-Day. Along that hostile coast, German machine gun nests are dug in, waiting. Artillery batteries are zeroed in on the beaches, ready to unleash hell. Just beyond the tide line, minefields and barbed wire are hidden, a deadly reception for anyone who makes it that far. And on one of these beaches, codenamed Juno, the soldiers preparing to step off those landing craft are Canadian. At this moment, they are not yet considered elite. They are not famous. Many are citizen soldiersmen who, just a few years earlier, were farmers, factory workers, teachers, and clerks. But what is about to happen on this stretch of sand will forever change how German commanders, including the elite Waffen-SS, view them. The story of why the SS feared the Canadians begins right here. As the landing craft ramps drop, the air explodes. German fire opens up instantly, a storm of lead and steel. Machine guns tear through the surf, cutting men down before they even reach dry sand. Mortars rain down, their explosions erupting among the boats and the waiting soldiers. The first moments are a scene of chaos and death. Heavy casualties are taken in the first waves. This part was expected, but what follows is not. The Canadian units do not stall on the beach. They do not get pinned down by the relentless fire. Despite the horrific losses in those initial minutes, platoons and companies reform almost immediately. Their non-commissioned officers and junior leaders taking charge. Engineers, under constant fire, begin the perilous work of clearing paths through the minefields and barbed wire. While they work, the infantry pushes forward, providing covering fire and then moving through the gaps. Unlike on some of the other beaches, the Canadians do not pause to consolidate their hold on the shoreline. Their doctrine, their training, and their sheer determination drive them inland. The beach is not the objective. It is merely the gateway. Their goal lies beyond the dunes, past the concrete bunkers in the villages and fields of Normandy. And they are moving towards it with ferocious speed. The German defensive plan for Normandy was built on a core assumption that any landing force would be delayed and contained at the water's edge. Their artillery fire plans, their reserve unit placements, everything was designed around the idea of a bloody, protracted fight on the beaches. The Canadians shattered that plan within hours. By mid-morning, Canadian troops had already broken through several of the Germans' main defensive lines. German observers in their fortified positions sent back frantic reports. Canadian infantry was advancing rapidly, moving right behind their tanks, using smoke screens to cover their movements and laying down overwhelming suppressive fire. They weren't just attacking, they were executing complex, combined arms tactics under the most intense combat conditions imaginable. By early afternoon, Canadian units were deeper inland than any other Allied force that landed on D-Day. They had pushed more than 10 kilometers into occupied France, an astonishing achievement. This wasn't luck. It was the result of meticulous planning, brutal training, incredible discipline, and a relentless, forward-moving momentum that the German defenders simply could not stop. The German command structure was built on order and predictability, and the Canadians were proven to be anything but. Back in the German headquarters, confusion was turning into alarm. The situation reports coming from the Juno Beach sector were increasingly grim and chaotic. Communications were being cut as Canadian units overran command posts and sliced through telephone lines. Defensive reserves, which were supposed to be held back for a major, coordinated counterattack, were being committed piecemeal, thrown into the fight just to try and slow the Canadian advance. It was a desperate attempt to plug holes in a dam that was breaking everywhere at once. The formidable 12th SS Panzer Division, the Hitler Jugend, composed of young, fanatical soldiers, was ordered to counterattack and throw the Allies back into the sea. But the situation on the ground was already unstable, far more fluid and dangerous than their maps suggested. Villages that German planners expected to hold out for days were falling within hours. Canadian patrols were suddenly appearing on roads deep behind the front lines, roads that were thought to be secure. German officers, accustomed to a certain rhythm of battle, began noting something unusual in their reports. These Canadian troops did not disengage easily. When they took a position, they held it. When they were attacked, they didn't just defend, they counterattacked with startling ferocity. When the first units of the Waffen-SS finally engaged the advancing Canadian formations, they did so with an air of supremacy. These were Hitler's elite, battle-hardened troops who had fought on the Eastern Front. They were trained to dominate through shock, aggression, and sheer intimidation. They expected the Allied soldiers to be hesitant, to be rattled by the appearance of the infamous SS. Instead, they ran into a buzzsaw. They encountered infantry that attacked them with a ferocity that matched their own. Canadian platoons didn't shy away from fortified German positions. They assaulted them directly. They used a combination of grenades, close-range rifle, and machine gun fire, and terrifyingly accurate, coordinated support from their Sherman tanks. The combat became close quarters, fast, and incredibly violent. Fights broke out in the narrow streets of French villages, in farmyards, and across hedgerows for SS troops whose reputation was built on breaking their enemy's will to fight. This was deeply unsettling. The Canadians were not reacting the way an enemy was supposed to. They didn't break. They didn't run. They fought back, often surrounding and destroying the SS units sent to stop them. Darkness finally fell on June 6th. The fighting didn't stop. For many Allied units, nightfall was a chance to dig in, consolidate their gains, and prepare for the next day. Not for the Canadians. They continued to push forward, probing into the darkness. Small patrols, masters of stealth and fieldcraft, moved through the treacherous hedgerows and slipped into German-held villages under the cover of night. For the German defenders, the night offered no respite. Attacks came from unexpected directions. The sound of Canadian voices or the sudden burst of a Bren gun would erupt from the darkness, followed by a swift, violent assault. Sleep became impossible. The constant pressure, the feeling of being hunted in the dark, began to take a psychological toll. A new kind of fear started to spread through the German ranks, not a fear of overwhelming numbers, a fear of this enemy's sheer unpredictability and relentless aggression. By the end of that first day, the Canadian forces had secured their beachhead and driven further inland than any other Allied unit, a remarkable feat of arms. German commanders, reviewing the day's disastrous reports, did not yet use the word fear when describing the men from the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division. They did begin to call them a problem, a very serious problem. The seeds of a formidable reputation had been sown in the blood and sand of Juno Beach, and they were beginning to grow. Thank you for watching. In Part 2, we'll explore how this reputation solidified in the brutal fighting for Normandy, leading to infamous orders and a cycle of violence that would define the Canadians' S-clashes for the rest of the war. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss it. So, how does fear really take root on a battlefield? It's not just propaganda posters or whispered rumors. It's born from brutal, first-hand experience. Imagine you read a German soldier in 1944. You start hearing stories from the guys coming back from the front lines. Stories about the Canadians. They say, when you attack the Canadians, they don't just hold the line, they hit you back, hard and fast. They say the Canadians keep coming, even after dark, when most armies would dig in and wait for sunrise. Dang, give up ground, easily. Okay, now, were all these stories 100% true? Probably not. War stories get embellished, details get twisted. Small counterattack becomes a ferocious onslaught. A stubborn defense becomes an unbreakable wall. But here's the thing. In the psychology of war, What soldiers believe is often more powerful than what actually happened. And the belief spreading through the German ranks was simple. Fighting the Canadians was a different kind of hell. This growing reputation wasn't a myth spun from thin air. It was a shadow cast by very real, very hard-won experience. By 1944, the Canadian Army wasn't the green force it had been at the start of the war. They had been forged in the fires of defeat and victory. They'd fought and bled in the desperate defense of Hong Kong. They learned the most painful lessons imaginable on the beaches of Dieppe, a disaster that reshaped their entire approach to combat. Then came the grueling campaigns in Sicily and Italy, where they honed their skills against some of the toughest German units. Through it all, a unique military doctrine began to emerge. Canadian officers placed immense trust in their junior leaders. Sergeants and lieutenants weren't just expected to follow orders. They were trained to think on their feet, to take initiative, to act independently. The philosophy was simple. If the radio goes dead, if the company commander is hit, the attack doesn't stop. You know the objective. You press on. This was a stark contrast to many German formations, including the formidable SS, which often relied on a more rigid, top-down command structure. In the chaotic, close-quarters combat of Normandy, where communication lines were constantly being cut and plans fell apart in minutes, this difference was critical. While a German unit might hesitate, waiting for new orders, the Canadians just kept moving, exploiting gaps and maintaining relentless pressure. This decentralized, adaptable approach made them incredibly difficult to predict and counter. Later, in 1944, this reputation would be cemented in one of the war's most brutal and overlooked campaigns, the Battle for the Scheldt Estuary. The task given to the 1st Canadian Army was monumental: clear a series of heavily fortified German positions to open the vital port of Antwerp for Allied supplies. The terrain was a nightmare. The Germans had flooded vast areas of low-lying polderland, channeling any attack into narrow causeways that were perfectly covered by machine guns and artillery. The defenders were determined, a mix of veteran paratroopers and hardened SS units ordered to fight to the last man. What followed was a meat grinder. Canadian troops attacked with what German reports described as relentless ferocity. Day after day, they waded through mud and water, launching aggressive assaults, often at night, to seize small patches of ground. German accounts from the battle are filled with a sense of shock at the Canadians' persistence. They describe constant pressure, positions being overrun in rapid, violent actions, and an enemy that simply would not let up. The Scheldt cost the Canadians over 6,000 casualties, but it also solidified their image in the minds of their opponents. They were the ones who would keep coming, no matter the cost, no matter how impossible the odds seemed. The legend was growing, written in the flooded fields of Holland. Now, we need to address a darker side of this reputation. Some German accounts from the war accuse Canadian soldiers of brutality, particularly regarding the treatment of prisoners. Historians approach these claims with caution. War is a brutal business, and atrocities were committed by all sides. There is absolutely no evidence to suggest there was any kind of systematic policy of cruelty unique to the Canadian forces. However, what happens on the battlefield at a micro level is what truly shapes a soldier's perception. When a unit takes heavy casualties, when they see their friends killed in a bitter fight for a small piece of ground, mercy can become a rare commodity. The lines blur. A German soldier attempting to surrender might be met with suspicion or outright aggression by men who have just survived a grenade attack from a supposedly surrendering position. Whether these incidents were widespread or isolated doesn't entirely matter to the soldier on the receiving end, or to the ones who hear the stories back in the trenches. Fear becomes a self-reinforcing loop. If German soldiers started to believe that surrendering to the Canadians was a risky proposition, they were more likely to fight to the death. This, in turn, would lead to even more brutal close-quarters fighting, which only reinforced the Canadians' reputation for being ferocious and uncompromising. In this way, fear, whether based in fact or perception, became a weapon in itself. By early 1945, the war had reached German soil, and the Canadian forces were a key part of the spearhead in the Rhineland campaign. This was the final push, and the nature of the fighting was again a testament to their experience. German defenders, fighting desperately on their home ground, consistently noted the speed of Canadian operations. They didn't just break through a defensive line. They exploited the breach immediately with relentless follow-up attacks, preventing any chance of an organized counterattack or the establishment of a new defensive position. Their armor and infantry worked in seamless, aggressive coordination. It's telling that in post-war interviews and interrogations, captured German soldiers often stated a preference for who they faced. Many said they would rather be up against British or even American units than the Canadians. And the reason they gave wasn't about cruelty. It was about predictability. With other Allied units, they felt they had a better sense of what to expect: a preparatory bombardment, a deliberate assault, a pause to consolidate. The Canadians, they said, were just unpredictable. They would attack at night, in bad weather, or from an unexpected direction. They were masters of improvisation, and that made them terrifying. So, let's bring it all back to the Waffen-SS, Hitler's so-called elite. The SS was more than just a military formation. It was built on an ideology of psychological dominance. They were the political soldiers, bred to believe in their own superiority and to inspire terror in their enemies. They saw themselves as the ultimate warriors, the Aryan ideal made manifest on the battlefield. And then they ran into the Canadians, and the Canadians shattered that illusion. They didn't just meet the SS head-on, they outfought them with a combination of grit and tactical flexibility that the rigid SS doctrine could uncounter. The Canadians advanced when they were expected to stop and regroup. They launched local counterattacks when they were expected to be reeling from a German assault. They adapted to the chaos of the battlefield faster than German commanders could revise their plans. The fear the SS developed for the Canadians wasn't ideological. It wasn't about one political system versus another. It was brutally practical. It was the fear of a fighter who has met someone who is not just as tough, but also smarter and more adaptable in the clinch. The Canadians systematically dismantled the psychological armor of the SS, proving that fanatical belief was no match for disciplined, intelligent, and relentless aggression. So, why were the elite SS troops genuinely afraid of the Canadians by the end of the war? It wasn't because the Canadians were superhuman, or born warriors, or uniquely violent. It was because they were terrifyingly effective. They were a learning army that had absorbed the brutal lessons of its early failures and forged them into a weapon. They were disciplined, aggressive, and incredibly adaptable. In war, a reputation isn't given. It's earned, it's paid for in blood, sweat, and split-second decisions made under fire. By 1945, from the beaches of Normandy to the flooded fields of the Scheldt and into the heart of Germany, the Canadians had earned theirs. They earned it under artillery fire. They earned it in the dark, in the mud. And they earned it face to face with the very men who once believed themselves to be the most feared soldiers in the world. Thanks for watching. If you found this piece of history interesting, be sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. See you next time.